everyone, welcome back to the Support the Spectrum channel. Today we're going to be talking about language demand, a very important topic in the speech therapy world and in the neurodivergent support world. The 7th video I ever made online was this. It's pretty long, and thank you to both my parents for being in it as the caregiver / educators in the skit. And I was obviously the non-speaking or limited speaking person using AAC. This is the first video we're going to talk about today that I have notes on. You know what I mean? If I were to make this video today, I would make it slightly differently. So we're going to talk about what I like about it and what I don't like about it. First, let's talk about the definition of language demand, okay? And why it's important in speech therapy. Language demand looks different for every learner depending on what stage of development they're at, okay? So we're not always expecting learners to craft these beautiful, accurate sentences, but sometimes language demand can be as simple as using a gesture or vocalization. So really what language demand is setting up a challenge for that learner, and educators know how essential that is in the learning process. So what I like about this video is I am exemplifying the importance of creating language demand. We as educators set our learners up to be ready for that language demand. And let me make myself clear, language demand should not even begin to be a thought until you've modeled that language behavior a ton of times. And remember, we model without expectations. That's the first step. So after weeks, months, years of modeling certain language behaviors, and we know we've seen that person do them independently, that's when we can place demand on that person, especially when we're working with neurodivergent people. But let's get into what is good about the video first. First of all, claps for the acting. You have to give Mama and Papa Sutera claps for acting. This took many takes, y'all. So they really did the best they could, and I think they did a wonderful job. Another thing I like about the video is that it encourages use of the AAC system, not only from the language learner and the AAC user, but also from the caregivers and educators. What actually inspired me to make this video was caregivers coming to me saying, my child doesn't say what they want or need. They don't advocate for themselves. How can I help them? And so creating language demand was a way to put the expectation not only on that language learner, but also on that caregiver, on the educator. We need to be using modeling and also creating a challenge for that person to use their AAC systems, or else they're not going to ever use it. And you run the risk of them not being understood by people around them. So I like that. I like how it encourages not only the non-speaking or limited speaking person to use the device, but also the caregivers and educators as well. We specifically saw that in the part of the video when my dad told me to wear my raincoat before going outside. Great example of modeling language. Another thing I really like about this video is how it highlights the dangers of being presumptuous. So in the first scene, you see me reaching out and you see my mom assuming that I want Cheez-Its. And that first presumption was right. But then later we see that I am showing a nonverbal behavior, and she assumes or presumes that it is me wanting attention. And so then my dad went to hold my hand, right? But when I actually went to go use my AAC system and my voice, I said that I wanted a hug. So you can see how sometimes when we assume what non-speaking people are trying to communicate, we're wrong. And there's no one to blame, you know? You're trying your best, and obviously you have the best of intentions, and you think that you know your language learner so well. I bet most of the time you are right when you are predicting their desires, but sometimes you're not. Sometimes you really need that person to be specific. I didn't want my hand to be held. I wanted a hug in that moment, you know? So it's good to encourage and model that language so then it can be later used for those moments. Okay, now let's get into what I would do differently now. If I were to make this video again today, I would definitely preface everything by saying you have to model targets, model language without expectations until you see the person using that language independently before you place the language demand on them. And even now that I'm thinking, let me rephrase that. You have to model the language, model the target without expectations. And if you see them starting to make attempts at using that language, then you can create a little bit of language demand and create expectations for them. This is so important. If I was going to use an analogy for this, I would say that you would never expect someone, let's say a young gymnast, you would never expect a young gymnast to be able to do a triple backflip without ever being modeled how to do it, without ever being trained how to do it, without maybe using the support of the trampoline first. It would just be a crazy expectation to put on them. You're almost setting them up to fail in a way, right? So the same thing happens when we're teaching someone language, especially neurodivergent people. We might need to do the training, the prep work, which is modeling without expectations for many weeks, months, or years before creating the expectation and the demand that they should be using that language independently. The importance of creating that demand is still there, right? But you just need to make sure you set it up first. Another thing I don't like about this video is that I didn't explicitly explain not to create language demand in moments of dysregulation. I did mention it in the caption, but if I were to remake this, I would put this in bold, highlighted, in your face. Do not create language demand in moments of dysregulation. Why? Because that's not a time for learning, right? That is a time when your smart brain, your ability to learn new things, receive new information, speak in a way that others can understand, think logically, problem solve, is turned off. That is a time when your emotional and survival brains are in full gear, and it's not the time to be putting expectations on others. It's only the time to help regulate them. So if there's anything you take away from this video, it's that there is a time and place for creating language demand, and that honestly is less time than you would think. Not during times of dysregulation, and not until you have modeled that language many times. Okay, and then the last thing I don't love about this video is that it didn't honor nonverbal behaviors as communication enough. What do I mean by that? I mean that there are many times when a neurodivergent person or a neurotypical person is expressing a type of behavior or is performing a type of behavior that expresses a communicative function. It's not language that they're using, but they might be slamming their hands down or fidgeting. They're showing these nonverbal cues that they are trying to communicate something. They just don't have the language for it yet. So while creating language demand is important, there are many times when you should just simply honor that nonverbal communication. You don't have to be pushing them every single time to create these sentences and to express in a way that everyone's going to understand, especially if they're in the comfort of their own home, or maybe, it's during their break time at school. You don't need to be pushing that expectation and forcing that demand, because it's their rest time, right? It's their time to just freely express. For example, if I wanted to express that I really wanted this thing on the top shelf and I needed my dad to get it for me, and I just point to it, my dad's not going to say, use your words, right? Especially because if that learner, that person already knows that language, they know that language, you don't have to push them every time to use it. especially in their break times. This nonverbal cue, this nonverbal behavior, you understand what that means. And so you should honor that a lot of the time. You don't want your language learners to get frustrated with the experience by putting too much demand on them. And the last thing I don't like about this video and what I would change is that I didn't include the process of creating language demand for Gestalt language processors. This was a very analytic language processing video because I was putting those single words together in a language strip, an I want language strip, and it doesn't reflect what therapy actually looks like, what language learning actually looks like. It's just one example of requesting as an analytic language processor would learn to request. So I would have included a variety of different phrases and language structures to reflect Gestalt language processing and also language learning during play, which is most often when people learn language. Okay, so just to recap, today's video was on language demand. We learned what it was. We learned when to implement language demand. We learned the importance of varied language demand. And we talked about how it could look different for each individual and also when not to do it, right? We learned the importance of not only the language learner using AAC, but also the caregivers and educators. And we learned not to be presumptuous, not to assume that you know what somebody is trying to communicate. Give them the chance to do it themselves. And that's everything. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for taking the time to sit with me and learn about neurodiversity affirming practices and language acquisition. I have so much fun making these videos, and if you're enjoying watching them, please subscribe. If you ever would like me to make a long form video about a certain topic or question that you have, you can send that question to me from my website, link in bio in the description. And yeah, thank you so much, guys. See you next time.